officers who still believed that the Valoran way was the only way. Cathari learned of the plot on a cold evening, when a young officer she had once trained knocked on her chamber door with shaking hands and a datapad full of encrypted communications. The old guard was planning a coup, a coordinated seizure of the Imperial fleet and every major military installation on Calith Dara, followed by a desperate all-out strike against human space with every ship the Empire could muster. The plan was madness, Cathari knew, a final furious charge into the teeth of a force that had already demonstrated beyond any doubt that it could swat them aside like insects. But she also knew that desperate creatures do not think clearly, and that the old guard would rather see the Empire burn than watch it change. She brought the information to her grandfather, and she found Kethvarin sitting alone in the dark of his war chamber, surrounded by the ancient records he had been reading every night since Dr. Osei's visit. He looked old, in a way she had never seen before. Not the weathered strength of a veteran, but the heavy tiredness of someone carrying a weight they had only just begun to understand. "I know about the coup," he said before she could speak, and his voice was quiet and rough, like stone grinding against stone. "Dren was never subtle, even when we were young." Cathari knelt before him, not in submission, but in earnest appeal, the way a granddaughter kneels before the only family she has left. "You have to stop it," she said, "not with soldiers and not with weapons. Those methods are what brought us here. You have to show them the truth the way it was shown to us." Kethvarin looked at her for a long time, and in her eyes he saw something that he had been searching for in those ancient records without knowing it. He saw the Valoran as they could be, not as they had been. He rose from his chair, and for a moment he looked like the warlord he had always been, tall and scarred and terrible. But when he spoke, his voice held something new. "Open a channel," he said, "to every ship, every station, every colony, every citizen. In the Empire, all of them." The broadcast went out at dawn, carried on every frequency and every network the Valoran Empire possessed, and it reached billions of ears across 1,000 worlds. Kethvarin did not give a speech about honor or duty or the glory of the Empire, because those words had been used so many times that they had been worn smooth of all meaning. Instead, he shared the data, all of it. Everything Dr. Osei had shown the War Council, the complete technical readout of Valoran military capabilities, and the long-range scan of human space, with its hundreds of warships, and its shipyards beyond counting. He let his people see the truth with their own eyes, and the truth was simple and terrible and undeniable. The Valoran Empire could not win a war against humanity. Not today, not in 100 years, not ever. The old guard's coup collapsed before it began, not because soldiers stopped them, but because the soldiers read the data and put down their weapons on their own. Warlord Dren was found alone in his chambers, sitting in silence, with his ceremonial blade laid across his knees. And when officers came to arrest him, he looked up with eyes that were not angry, but empty, and he went without a fight. The construction of Threshold Station began 3 weeks later, in the neutral space between Valoran and human territory, and it was built by teams from both species working side by side, in a collaboration that neither side found easy, but both sides found necessary. The station was beautiful, in a way that surprised everyone, because the Valoran architects had designed it with a grace and artistry that had not been seen in their work for centuries, as if something long buried had been uncovered and brought back into the light. The Dawn Accords were negotiated aboard Threshold over the course of 8 weeks, and they were unlike any treaty the galaxy had ever seen. Humanity did not demand tribute, territory, or submission, or any of the things that every conquering power in galactic history had always demanded. Instead, Dr. Osei and her team proposed a mutual development pact, human technology and expertise offered freely to the Valoran, in exchange for one condition that was simple in its wording and revolutionary in its implications. The conquered species of the Valoran Empire would be given the right of self-determination. Those who wished to leave could leave, free and unharmed, and those who wished to stay could stay, but as partners and equals rather than subjects and slaves. The debates were fierce, and the compromises were painful, but in the end, the words were written and the terms were set, and the document was ready for signing. On the day of the signing, 3 figures stood together on the ceremonial platform at the heart of Threshold Station, and the image of them standing side by side was broadcast across the galaxy to every species that had a receiver to catch it. Dr. Amara Ose stood on the left with her warm smile and her simple clothes, and the data tablet that had changed the course of history tucked under her arm. Sub-Commander Cathari stood on the right, in a new uniform that bore no symbols of conquest, only the ancient Valoran glyph for builder that had not been used in official capacity for 500 years. And between them, freed from a Valoran prison just 2 weeks earlier, stood Admiral Ciala Fen of the Kirath, her silver feathers still dull from captivity, but her sharp eyes, bright and wet with tears she did not try to hide. Ciala's hands trembled as she held the ceremonial pen, and before she signed, she turned to Dr. Ose with a question that had been burning inside her since the day the prison doors opened. "Why did you not come sooner?" she asked, and her voice broke on the last word. "We were dying. My people were dying, and you had the power to stop it. Why did you wait?" Paul went quiet, and 1,000 eyes turned to the small human woman who had walked unarmed into the heart of an empire. Dr. Ose's smile faded, and for the first time since she had arrived on Kalis Dara, her composure cracked, and the pain that showed beneath it was so raw and so real that even the hardest Valoran warlords in the gallery looked away. "That question keeps us awake at night," she said, and her voice was barely a whisper. "And I promise you this, on behalf of every human being alive, we will never let it happen again." Ciala held her gaze for a long moment, and then she nodded once, and signed the accords with a hand that had stopped shaking. Kethfaran signed last, and when the pen left the page, he set it down and stepped back from the table, and announced his abdication in a voice that carried the weight of 1,000 years of empire. He named Kethari as his successor, the first Valoran leader in recorded history to take power without shedding a single drop of blood. And the hall erupted in a sound that was not quite cheering and not quite weeping, but something in between, that no species in the galaxy had a word for. That evening, as the celebrations continued inside, and diplomats and officers from a dozen species mingled in the corridors of Threshold Station, Admiral Jonah Mbewe stood alone on the observation deck and looked out at the stars. The nebula that had once hidden humanity from the galaxy glowed in the distance, and around the station, Valoran and human ships flew in shared formation for the first time, their running lights blinking in patterns that wove together like threads in a tapestry. Captain Ilara Mwangi found him there, still in her uniform, and she stood beside him and watched the ships for a while in comfortable silence. "Do you think it will last?" she asked. Admiral Mbewe was quiet for a long time, his dark eyes reflecting the light of distant stars, and when he finally spoke, his voice was gentle and certain in a way that made Mwangi think of her father. "It does not have to last forever," he said. "It just has to last long enough for them to see what we see." Mwangi tilted her head and looked up at him. "And what is that?" He smiled, and it was a smile full of warmth and sadness and hope all tangled together. "That the universe is far too big and far too beautiful to waste on war." Outside the observation windows, Threshold Station glowed like a small warm star in the vast cold dark of space, and beyond it, the nebula shimmered with the light of 100 engine trails from ships of a dozen species, all flying outward together into the endless, and magnificent unknown. The disabled fleet was towed home by human vessels, and that detail alone sent shockwaves through the Valoran Empire that no amount of propaganda could contain. Valoran warships, the most feared instruments of destruction in the known galaxy, were dragged back to Imperial space like broken carts pulled by patient animals. And the human ships that towed them did so with a gentleness that was somehow more humiliating than violence. Every officer, every soldier, every citizen who watched the fleet limp home understood the message without it needing to be spoken. The humans could have destroyed them and chose not to, and that choice said more about the balance of power than any battle ever could. Fleet Commander Ryvok was stripped of his rank within hours of his return and thrown into a military prison on Kalith Dara, and no one spoke in his defense because there was nothing to say. Supreme Warlord Kethvaran sat in his war chamber and stared at the tactical report for the fourth day in a row, and the numbers had not changed no matter how many times he read them. 90 seconds, 200 warships disabled, 0 casualties on either side, and the weapon signatures did not match anything in the Valoran scientific database. His advisors brought him theories and explanations and reassurances, and he dismissed them all with a wave of his clawed hand, because they were guessing, and he knew it and they knew it. Then the human ambassador arrived, and she was nothing like what anyone expected. A single small shuttle descended through the atmosphere of Kalith Dara and landed on the grand platform outside the Imperial Palace, and from it stepped a single human woman with no guards, no weapons, and no entourage. Her name was Dr. Amara Osei, and she was short even by human standards, with dark skin and silver-streaked hair pulled back from a round face that carried a warm and genuine smile. She wore simple clothes, a uniform or armor, or anything that suggested military authority, and she carried nothing but a thin data tablet tucked under one arm. The Valoran honor guard that met her on the landing platform towered over her by nearly 3 feet, their polished armor gleaming and their ceremonial blades held at attention. And Dr. Osei walked between them with the easy confidence of someone taking a morning stroll through a garden. She greeted each guard she passed with a small nod and a word of welcome in their own language, and the pronunciation was so perfect that several of the guards broke composure and stared after her as she passed. Kethvaran had convened the Imperial War Council for her arrival. 100 of the most powerful warlords in the Valoran Empire gathered in the great stone hall that had stood for 800 years at the heart of imperial power. They sat in rising tiers around a central floor, their scarred faces hard and their golden eyes sharp. Mood in the room was one of wounded fury, barely held in check. Several warlords had already spoken before Dr. Osei's arrival, and their arguments were predictable and loud. Rally every fleet, call up every reserve, mobilize the full military strength of the Empire, and crush this upstart species before they became a true threat. Warlord Dren, the oldest and most decorated of them all, had pounded his fist on the stone railing and declared that the honor of the Valoran demanded nothing less than the total destruction of human civilization. The hall had roared in agreement, and for a moment it felt as though the decision had already been made. Then Dr. Osei was escorted onto the central floor, and the roaring stopped. She stood in the middle of that ancient hall, surrounded by 100 predators who had collectively conquered more worlds than she could count, and she looked up at them, with a warmth in her eyes that none of them knew how to. "Thank you for receiving me," she said, and her voice was clear and carried well despite the size of the room. "I know this is not easy for any of you, and I respect the courage it takes to listen to someone you consider an enemy." A few warlords snarled at the word courage, but Kethvaran raised a hand, and the hall went silent. "You may speak," he said, from his elevated throne at the top of the chamber, "but choose your words carefully, human." Dr. Osei nodded, and then she held up the data tablet she had carried from her shuttle. "Before I say anything else, I would like to offer a gift," she said, "a gesture of honesty between our peoples." She activated the tablet, and its contents were projected onto the great holographic display at the center of the hall for every warlord to see. The room went still in a way that had nothing to do with discipline and everything to do with shock. The tablet contained a complete technical readout of the Valoran Empire's military capabilities, every ship class with full specifications, every weapon system with performance data, every garrison with troop numbers, every supply line with route details, every classified research project with development status. All of it was accurate, and all of it was current as of that morning. The silence that followed was the loudest thing that had ever filled that hall. Warlord Dren rose slowly from his seat, and his face had gone from angry red to a pale gray that made him look 20 years older. "How?" he whispered, and the word echoed off the stone walls. Dr. Osei lowered the tablet and spoke with a gentleness that somehow made every word land harder. "The United Terran Confederacy has been observing the wider galaxy for over 100 years, she said. "We watched your empire grow. We watched you conquer the Relari and the Jovine and the Tessic. We watched the coalition form, and we watched it fall. Watched the bombardment of Aethys Prime." She paused, and the warmth in her eyes shifted to something deeper and more painful. "We chose not to intervene, not because we were afraid, but because we were not asked. And I want you to know that the weight of that choice is something my people carry with great sorrow." The hall erupted in angry voices, warlords shouting over each other about threats and provocations, and the arrogance of this tiny creature standing before them. But Dr. Osei waited patiently, with her hands folded, until the noise died down on its own. Then she spoke again, and this time her voice carried an edge that had not been there before. "I understand that many of you wish to go to war with humanity. So let me show you one more thing." She tapped the tablet, and the holographic display changed to show a single image, a long-range scan of human-controlled space as seen from the edge of the Valon Nebula. The image showed a territory, dense with shipyards and orbital stations and defensive platforms and fleet formations so numerous that the display could barely render them all without overlapping. And at the center of it all, like wolves resting in a forest, sat hundreds of ships that matched the energy signature of the Achilles. "The vessel that disabled your fleet is not our greatest weapon," Dr. Osei said, and her voice was quiet now, almost gentle. "It is not even close. It is a border patrol vessel, one of many." The hall was silent again, but this silence was different from the first one. The first silence had been shock, and this silence was something closer to the feeling a creature gets when it looks over the edge of a cliff and truly understands for the first time how far there is to fall. Dr. Osei put down the tablet, and when she spoke again, the edge was gone from her voice, and only the warmth remained. "But I did not come here to threaten you," she said. "You a question." She looked directly up at Keth Varan on his throne, and the old warlord found that he could not look away from her small dark eyes. "You have conquered everything you could reach," she said. "Your empire spans 1,000 worlds. Are your people happier? Are they safer? Is your empire stronger today than it was before the wars began?" The question hung in the air like smoke, and no one answered, because to answer honestly would be to admit something that every warlord in that room already knew, but had never dared to say aloud. In the tiers above, a young Valoran officer named Subcommander Ketheri sat very still, and felt something shift inside her chest, like a lock turning open. Ketheri was Keth Varan's own granddaughter, trained from birth for command, and marked for greatness by blood and talent alike. And she had spent the last 3 years stationed on conquered worlds, where she had seen things that her training had not prepared her. She had seen the resentment in the eyes of subject species, the endless cycle of uprisings and crackdowns, the staggering cost of maintaining an empire held together by fear rather than loyalty. And she had begun to wonder in the quiet hours whether the Valoran were building something that could last, or something that was already crumbling from within. She looked at Dr. Osei, standing small and alone on that great stone floor. And for the first time, she saw not an enemy, but an answer. That night, long after the council had adjourned, and the warlords had retreated to their chambers, to argue and scheme and worry, Keth Varen sat alone in his private war chamber, and did something he had not done in over a century. He opened the oldest historical records in the Imperial Archive, files so ancient that they predated the Empire itself, and he read about his people as they had been before the conquests. He read about Valoran, who built cities of breathtaking beauty, who composed music that made listeners weep, who studied the stars not as territory to be claimed, but as mysteries to be understood. He read about a civilization that had been driven by wonder rather than hunger, and he searched the faces in the ancient images for something he recognized. He did not find it, and he did not sleep that night. The censor officer aboard the Iron Verdict spoke first, and her voice cracked on the second word, in a way that would have earned her a punishment detail under normal circumstances. But these were not normal circumstances. Fleet Commander, the gravity distortion has resolved. It is a single vessel. It is behind us. Ryvok turned slowly in his command chair and stared at the tactical display as it painted a picture that his mind refused to accept. A ship sat motionless in the space behind his fleet, and it was enormous. The Iron Verdict was one of the largest warships in the Valoran Navy, a vessel that could carry 10,000 soldiers and enough weapons to level a continent, and this human ship made it look like a rowboat floating beside a mountain. It was angular and brutal in its design, with sharp lines and layered armor plating that gave it the appearance of something that had been built not for elegance, but for a single, terrible purpose. It was made of materials that Valoran scanners could not identify, no matter how many times they swept across it, and the energy signatures radiating from deep within the vessel matched nothing in any known database. It simply sat there, dark and silent and patient, like a predator that had already decided the hunt was over. "Hail them," Ryvok ordered, and if his voice was slightly tighter than before, no one on the bridge dared to notice. The comm officer sent the standard hailing signal on every frequency the Valoran used, and for a long stretch of seconds there was nothing but silence in return. "No response, Fleet Commander." "Hail them again." Still no response. Ryvok's jaw tightened, and the scales along his neck ridge darkened the way they always did when his blood ran hot. "Lock weapons on that vessel," he commanded. "Full targeting scan. All batteries." The weapons officer carried out the order with hands that were not quite steady, and 200 warships turned their guns toward the massive human vessel and painted it with enough targeting beams to turn a small moon into gravel. The response was immediate. Every single display on every single ship in the Valoran fleet went dark at the same instant, and for one horrible heartbeat, the entire armada was blind. Then the screens came back to life, but they no longer showed tactical data or navigation charts or weapons readouts. Instead, every screen on every ship displayed the same message, written in perfect Valoran script, in characters that burned bright red against a black background. The message said, "That was unwise." Ryvok stared at the words on his own command screen, and around him the bridge had gone so quiet that he could hear the blood rushing through his own veins. Before he could speak, before he could even form the thought of what to say, the human ship moved. But moved was not the right word for what it did, because movement implied traveling through space from one point to another, and this vessel did not travel. It simply ceased to exist in one location and began to exist in another, as if the space between the 2 points had folded like paper and pressed together for just an instant before springing back to normal. One moment the ship was behind the fleet, and the next moment it was sitting in the exact center of Ryvok's formation, surrounded on all sides by Valoran warships that suddenly looked very small and very fragile. The ship still deployed no visible weapons, raised no shields that scanners could detect, and made no aggressive moves of any kind. It simply waited. A communication channel opened, and the face that appeared on screen was that of a human male, older than Captain Wangi had been, with dark skin and gray hair at his temples, and deep brown eyes that held a weight of calm authority that Rivok recognized, because he had seen it in the eyes of others from the old times. People who had seen the rise and fall of civilizations, and understood the delicate balance between authority and survival. Supreme Warlord Kethvarin. Fleet Commander Rivok, the human said, and his voice was quiet and measured, and carried the gravity of someone who did not need to raise his voice to be heard. I am Admiral Jonah Mbewe of the United Terran Confederacy, commanding the warship Achilles. Rivok opened his mouth to respond, but Admiral Mbewe continued without pause. You graduated from the Valoran Imperial War Academy at the age of 42, ranked 7th in your class. You served under Warlord Dren during the Siege of Kolvaris, and were promoted to Fleet Commander after the Battle of the Shattered Moons. You have a mate named Tassara, and 2 offspring who attend the Imperial Youth Academy on Talith Dara. The bridge went cold, not in temperature, but in the way that a room goes cold when every person in it realizes at the same moment that the world has shifted beneath their feet. That information was classified, buried deep within Imperial military records, protected by the most advanced encryption the Valoran had ever created, and this human had just recited it the way someone might read from a restaurant menu. How? Rivok whispered, and he did not even realize he had spoken aloud. Admiral Mbewe did not answer the question. You have entered Terran sovereign space with hostile intent, the Admiral said instead. I am offering you a single opportunity to power down your weapons and withdraw your fleet. This offer will not be repeated. Rivok looked at the faces of his officers and saw fear in every one of them, raw and undisguised in a way that Valoran officers were trained from birth to hide. And because he was afraid too, and because fear in a Valoran often turns to fury the way water turns to steam, Rivok made the worst decision of his career. All ships, he shouted, rising from his chair with his claws extended and his teeth bared. Open fire! 200 warships unleashed everything they had. Plasma cannons roared. Kinetic accelerators hurled projectiles at near light speed. Missile bays emptied their payloads in cascading waves, and energy beams of every frequency the Valoran had ever weaponized converged on the Achilles from every direction at once. The barrage was magnificent and terrible, enough concentrated destructive force to crack a planet's mantle, and it struck the human warship with a fury that lit up the void like a newborn star. When the light faded and the sensors cleared, the Achilles sat exactly where it had been, completely untouched. But untouched was not accurate either, because the ship had not deflected the weapons fire or shielded against it in any way that Valoran technology could understand. It had absorbed it. Every beam and projectile and missile had struck the hull and simply vanished into it, swallowed like rain falling into an ocean. And the energy readings from the Achilles were now higher than they had been. Before the attack, the ship had converted their weapons fire into additional power. Rivok stood frozen on his bridge, his claws still extended, his teeth still bared, locked in a posture of aggression that now looked less like a predator attacking, and more like a small animal trying to make itself look bigger. Then the Achilles responded. It did not fire massive weapons, or launch devastating volleys, or unleash any kind of overwhelming destructive force. Instead, it struck with surgical precision, so exact and so controlled that it was almost worse than raw destruction. Because destruction could be understood as the act of arrival. But this was something else entirely. This was the act of a parent taking a dangerous toy from a child. In 90 seconds it was over. Every Valoran warship in the fleet was disabled. Engines killed with pinpoint strikes that fused reactor cores without detonating them. Weapon systems locked down by energy pulses. Rewrote targeting software at the molecular level. Communications arrays severed with beams so precise they cut antenna arrays free without scorching the hull beneath. But on every single ship, without exception, the life support systems continued to function perfectly. The lights stayed on, the air kept flowing, the gravity plating held steady, and 12,000 Valoran crew members sat in their crippled ships, alive and unharmed and utterly helpless. The comm channel opened one final time, and Admiral Mbewe looked at Ryvok with an expression that held no anger, and no triumph, and no cruelty, just a calm and patient sadness that somehow hurt worse than any of those things would have. "Your crews will live," the Admiral said. "Your empire will receive one ambassador. What happens next depends entirely on how well your warlord listens." The channel closed, and the Achilles turned away and took up a holding position above the drifting fleet like a shepherd, standing over a scattered flock. And in the silence that followed, Ryvok sank back into his chair and stared at nothing. Far away on the undying flame, Supreme Warlord Kesvarin received the full tactical report from Overseer Drin, and he read it 3 times in perfect silence while the old intelligence officer stood before him and waited. When Kesvarin finally looked up, his golden eyes held something that Drin had never seen in 2 centuries of service, something that looked wrong and alien on the face of the most powerful warlord in the galaxy. Drin recognized it because he had felt it himself an hour ago, when the first readings came through. "That is fear, Supreme Warlord," Drin said quietly. "And for the first time in my career, I believe it is the appropriate response." The Valoran subjugation fleet dropped out of slipspace at the edge of the Valen Nebula, and the first thing Fleet Commander Ryvok noticed was how quiet everything was. He had expected empty frontier space, perhaps a few scattered mining stations or primitive satellites, the kind of clutter that young civilizations left at their borders, like toys forgotten in a yard. Instead, there was nothing but darkness and stars, and a single small object, drifting exactly at the boundary line where Valoran charts marked the beginning of human-claimed territory. "What is that?" Ryvok asked, leaning forward in his command chair aboard the Iron Verdict. His sensor officer studied the readings for a moment before answering with confusion in her voice. "It appears to be an automated relay buoy, Fleet Commander. It is broadcasting a message." On screen. The message appeared on every display across the bridge, and what made Ryvok's eye ridges rise was not the content, but the fact that it was written in perfect Valoran script, every symbol precise and correctly formed. The message read, "You are entering the sovereign territory of the United Terran Confederacy. State your intentions. You will not be warned again." Ryvok read it twice, and then he laughed, a sharp barking sound that echoed off the metal walls of the bridge. His officers joined in, because that was what officers did when their commander laughed, and for a moment the bridge felt almost cheerful. "Destroy the buoy," Ryvok ordered, still amused, "and take us in." A single cannon blast turned the buoy into sparkling dust, and the fleet moved forward in tight formation, 200 warships pushing deeper into the silence. They had traveled for 6 hours when the sensor officer spoke again, her voice carrying a note of surprise she could not quite hide. "3 contacts ahead, Fleet Commander. They appear to be ships." Ryvok straightened in his chair as the tactical display updated, and what he saw made him frown, not with concern, but with confusion. 3 ships sat directly in the fleet's path, and they were impossibly small by Valoran standards, each one barely larger than a Valoran patrol corvette. They were shaped unlike anything in the Imperial database, sleek and angular, with dark hulls that seemed to drink in the light rather than reflect it. and they made no move to flee, despite being outnumbered nearly 70-1. "Open a channel," Ryvok said. The comm screen flickered, and a human face appeared for the first time before Valoran eyes. She was small and dark-skinned, with close-cropped hair and calm brown eyes that held no fear and no anger, just a steady watchfulness that reminded Ryvok of the way deep ocean predators looked at things from below. "This is Captain Alaram Wangi of the United Terran Confederacy Border Patrol," she said, and her voice was even and unhurried. "Terran's sovereign space with a military fleet, and without authorization, you are directed to withdraw immediately." Ryvok studied her face with open curiosity, taking in the soft skin and the small rounded teeth visible when she spoke, and the complete absence of scales or claws or any natural weapon. So this was a human, he thought, and he was not impressed. "I am Fleet Commander Ryvok of the Valoran Empire," he announced. "Your species has been selected for incorporation into the Empire. You will surrender your worlds, your resources, and your military assets immediately. Resistance will result in the destruction of your civilization." He delivered the words with the practiced ease of someone who had given this speech before, because he had, 3 times, to 3 different species, and every single one of them had either surrendered on the spot or been crushed within days. Captain Mwangi did not react the way any of them had reacted, pale, or stammer, or beg. She simply went quiet for exactly 10 seconds, and in that silence, Ryvok felt something shift in the air around him, though he could not have explained what it was. "Acknowledged," Mwangi said finally, and her voice had not changed at all. "Forwarding your response to Fleet Command." The 3 frigates turned and accelerated away, and what happened next sent a ripple of murmurs across every bridge in the Valoran fleet. The human ships moved at a speed that should not have been possible for vessels of any size. Their acceleration so violent and so sudden that they went from standing still to vanishing off long-range sensors in less than 4 seconds. Ryvok's chief navigator stared at his instruments with his mouth hanging open in a way that was deeply undignified for an officer of his rank. "That acceleration profile does not match any known propulsion technology," he said, and his voice was barely above a whisper. "Running," Ryvok declared, loud enough for the whole bridge to hear. "As they should. Continue on course." But as the fleet pushed deeper into human space, things began to change in small ways that were hard to name and harder to ignore. Ships at the edges of the formation started losing sensor contact for brief moments, just a flicker here and there, as if something was passing between them, too fast to track. Navigation buoys that the fleet had deployed behind them shifted position by tiny amounts, so small that the computers almost dismissed the changes as errors. Long-range communications developed a strange quality, faint ghost signals buried in the background noise that sounded almost like whispered conversations in a language no one on board could identify. And then the fleet's central AI network began flagging anomalies at an alarming rate. Millions of micro-intrusions were being detected across every ship in the formation. Tiny probes, testing firewalls and scanning data cores, and mapping system architectures with a speed and sophistication that the AI could barely track, let alone stop. Someone was inside their networks, not breaking anything, not stealing anything, just looking at everything with the casual thoroughness of a doctor examining a patient. Ryvok dismissed the reports as sensor malfunctions caused by the nebula's interference, but his officers exchanged glances behind his back that spoke of growing unease. Far away on the throne world of Caliph Dara, Overseer Drin was not dismissing anything. He had requested a full intelligence re-evaluation on humanity the moment the border buoy's message had been relayed back to him, because that message had been written in flawless Valoran, and the only way to write flawless Valoran was to have studied the language extensively. The old intercepted transmissions were pulled from the archives and analyzed again with fresh eyes and better tools. What Drin found made his pale green scales darken with dread. Those transmissions were old, very old, dating back over a century, and they represented the earliest and most primitive era of human space exploration. There was almost no current data on human capabilities, because somehow, impossibly, humanity had managed to keep the galaxy blind to their development for over 100 years. The nebula that surrounded their territory was not a natural barrier that had kept them trapped and isolated. It was a curtain, and they had been building behind it this entire time. Drin opened an emergency channel to Fleet Commander Ryvok, his clawed fingers trembling slightly as he entered the codes. Ryvok, this is Overseer Drin. I am ordering you to halt your advance and hold position until further notice. Our intelligence on the humans is dangerously incomplete. I repeat, halt your advance immediately. Ryvok's face appeared on the screen, confident and brave, dismissive and full of the blind courage that Drin had always privately considered to be the most dangerous quality a military commander could possess. With respect, Overseer, I have 200 warships under my command. Whatever these humans have been building behind their little cloud of gas, it will not be enough. Ryvok out. The channel went dead, and Drin sat alone in his office, surrounded by screens full of data that told him almost nothing about what was waiting in the darkness ahead. Then his console chimed with an alert from the fleet's deep space sensor array, and when he read it, the blood drained from his face in a way that left his scales looking almost white. A gravity distortion had been detected behind the Valoran fleet. Something massive had just dropped out of slipspace at their rear, and it was not broadcasting any identification signal at all. Drin stared at the readings, and the silence of his office pressed against him like that. Weight of deep water, and he understood with terrible clarity that everything was about to change. The sky above Aethys Prime burned orange and red as the last stronghold of the Galactic Coalition crumbled under orbital fire. Supreme Warlord Keth Varan stood at the viewing deck of his flagship, the Undying Flame, and watched the destruction below with cold golden eyes that showed no mercy and no regret. He was tall, even by the standards of the Valoran, a reptilian species that had ruled the stars for over 1,000 years, and his scarred gray scales told the story of 100 battles won across 100 worlds. Behind him, officers moved in silence, their clawed feet clicking softly against the metal floor as they carried out orders with the precision of a species that had turned war into an art form. The coalition had lasted 2 years against the full might of the Valoran Empire, and Keth Varan considered that an insult rather than an achievement. 7 species had banded together in desperation, pooling their fleets and their courage. Brief moment, the galaxy had believed they might hold the line. But courage meant nothing against superior firepower, and the Valoran had firepower beyond anything the coalition could match. A transmission crackled through the bridge speakers, and the voice that came through was broken and exhausted. "This is Admiral Sila Fen of the Galactic Coalition," the voice said, and Keth Varan could hear the trembling beneath her words. "We accept your terms. We surrender unconditionally." Keth Varan tilted his head slightly, a gesture that among his kind meant amusement rather than curiosity. Admiral Fen was Kirath, one of the tall avian species with feathers like polished silver and eyes that could see across vast distances, and she had been a worthy opponent in the early months of the war. But worthy opponents still lost when they stood against the Valoran. "Your surrender is accepted," Keth Varan said, his deep voice carrying across the bridge. Distant thunder. "But your people will remember the cost of resistance." He gave a small nod to his weapons officer, and a fresh volley of orbital strikes rained down on the civilian districts of Aethys Prime. It was not necessary from a military standpoint, and everyone on the bridge knew that. It was a lesson, a message carved in fire and ash for every species in the galaxy to read and understand. The message was simple: do not resist the Valoran Empire. Admiral Fenn screamed something over the comm channel, but Keth Varin had already turned away, his attention moving to more important matters. An hour later, the fires still glowed on the surface below, as Overseer Drin entered the war chamber, with a data tablet clutched in his thin, clawed hands. Drin was the head of Valoran intelligence, a smaller and more cautious creature than the warlords he served, with pale green scales and eyes that never stopped calculating. He bowed low before Keth Varin, and then activated the holographic display at the center of the room. A map of the Orion Arm spread out before them, glowing blue and gold, and every system was marked with the crimson sigil of the Valoran Empire. "The conquest is complete, Supreme Warlord," Drin said, and there was pride in his voice, despite his usual restraint. "Every known species in the Orion Arm has submitted to Imperial rule. The Coalition was the last organized resistance, and it is finished." Keth Varin studied the map with the patience of a predator surveying territory it had already claimed. "Every known species," he repeated, catching the careful choice of words. Drin hesitated for just a moment before tapping the display, and the map shifted to show a remote region of the galaxy partially hidden behind a thick band of nebula gas. "There is one remaining civilization of note," Drin said, "a species called humans. They occupy a small cluster of systems behind the nebula. Valen Nebula, perhaps 8 to 12 colony worlds at most." "And why have they not been contacted?" Keth Varin asked without looking up. "They are isolated, Supreme Warlord. The nebula creates significant interference with standard slipspace routes, and their territory has been considered too remote and too insignificant to warrant attention. We intercepted some of their deep space transmissions several decades ago." "And what did those transmissions reveal?" Drin pulled up a series of old recordings, fragments of human broadcasts that had leaked through the nebula, and the war chamber filled with strange alien sounds, music and voices and bursts of chaotic signal noise. "They are a short-lived species," Drin explained, "average lifespan of roughly 80 to 100 standard years. They are physically fragile. No natural armor, no claws, no venom. Their early transmissions suggest a species prone to emotional outbursts and internal conflict. Technologically, our projections place them several generations behind even the weakest Coalition members." Keth Varin watched the data scroll past with the same disinterest he might show a report about weather patterns on a mining colony. "Send a subjugation fleet," he said. "Standard protocol. Bring them to heel." Drin bowed again and made a note on his tablet. "I will assign Fleet Commander Ryvok," he said. "He has been requesting a command opportunity, and this should be a straightforward operation." Keth Varin waved a clawed hand in dismissal, already thinking about the reconstruction plans for the conquered Coalition worlds, and the tributes that would soon flow into the Imperial treasury. Ryvok was young and arrogant, and hungry for glory, which made him perfect for a simple task like this. 200 warships would